Thank you everyone for turning up this evening, and welcome to the other 7.97 billion people out there who will be watching this later on recorded video. So tonight's a good chance just to talk about the Cellar Plan. We've got up to an hour to do it. I think we can probably cover it a bit faster than that. The reference that we're using now, I know Whiskey Partners is how you understand the business that we're working with, but looking forward will be known as House of Decant. And so everything that we talk about in the wine space will be through that lens and so forth in future. So the Cellar Plan is an important part of what we're doing. We internally refer to it as the Forward Drinkers Club because it's important to think about what is the purpose of doing this. And that's where I'm going to start talking tonight. I'm going to go through about 6 points for you before we end up with a Q&A session at the end. You can always ask your questions in the manner that Alice referenced at the start. That's no problems. But to begin with, I want to explain why we're doing it. First of all, why it's important to us, what we're trying to achieve, and what our philosophy is around the Cellar Plan. And then I want to talk about the reasons why you're interested and find out, because that is really critical to understanding how we get the best outcome for you. And then we're going to start talking about how the Cellar Plan works and what fine wine actually is, and the process of managing the Cellar Plan. Then we'll talk about some of the things about why the Cellar Plan will suit you, why it's a convenient program to get involved in. And then finally, I'll talk about the types of wines that we're buying and what our sourcing process is. And also, more importantly, some of the wines that we choose not to buy. So I'll start with our philosophy, and we really think about the drinker in the end. We are really forward drinkers. We're always planning ahead. We're not just thinking about what we want to be drinking this week. We're really thinking about what we want to drink this year, at Christmas, in 3 years' time, in 5 years' time. We're looking at wines when they're very young and thinking about when they'll be at their optimum potential in another 3, 5, 7, or even 10 years in mind. So the point of the Cellar Plan is also, it's not just that we're building something that people are planning to consume. Part of the joy of the Cellar Plan is the knowledge that you're building something for later on. You're building something that's only going to get better with time. And more importantly, it's going to get better without additional effort from your behalf. So in this way, I sometimes think of it as the lawn that mows itself, or the child who cleans their own room, or the language skills you've been working on, but you don't need to speak them to improve. You know, building a wine cellar is something just gets better over time once you've made those choices to participate. We often think about collectors as, you can think of them as investors, that's for sure. But collectors also have more choices available to them than the straight investor. If we think about this purely through the lens of financial gain, that is one way of looking at the Cellar Plan, but it's not the only reason why we'll be doing this. Your goals could also be very hedonistic, in that you might choose to drink some of the cellar yourself, either in its entirety or even partially, or they could be very altruistic, in the sense that you might be wanting to preserve some of your wealth for the next generation. You might want to be tax effective. In that sense, sometimes we think of the Cellar Plan as a WISA, or a wine ISA, where you can put money away into it. You generate some of the same tax effective benefits as you do in an ISA. You're not subject to capital gains tax. Obviously, you can put in more than the ISA situation, which is capped at 20 grand a year. So that's a benefit. But those plans are obviously hollow logs that you can tap later on, which if you've got a child who wants to get married or put a deposit on a house, or if you want to pass on an inheritance to somebody, they can be very smart ways to do it. We've had many collectors who have put money into wine for the simple reason that they feel if they give their children cash, they'll spend their inheritance fairly quickly. And putting money into wine can be a very good way of slowing down that process. So they're important things to think about. I think also, so whether you're financially motivated, hedonistically motivated, or altruistically motivated, there are a lot of reasons for being involved in the Cellar Plan. But for us, we're always thinking about the consumer at the end. And I know it sounds unusual from your perspective to think that, you know, you're talking about building a collection and putting money in for a long period of time. But we are always looking about the person at the end who's going to drink the wine. Because if we are not buying wines that ultimately people want to consume, we are going to fail. We're not going to have wines that you might want to consume yourself. We're not going to have wines that the trade may want to list in their restaurants. We're not going to have mature bottles that other people in the world around us will be interested in drinking in 5 years' time. So we look for things that are hard to find, that can improve with age, that will reach their peak in several years. But also we want to cultivate collectors and drinkers because we know it's important to give you options to sell your wine collection later on, if that's your choice. So part of the Cellar Plan is it's a nucleus business in what we're doing at House of Decant. We will have an e-commerce website around us. We'll have a trade arm around us, and they're going to give us more options about what we do with the wines in your cellar once we get to the period of time where you've made a decision about what you want to do with the wines. So it is really important for us to know why you want to do it. It can be very financial. So in that sense, we want to know how long you plan to be invested for. We often say 5 years is a very sensible minimum. You may make a return on wines in a shorter period of time than that, and that can be fine. But we don't tend to necessarily expect the best returns in a short period of time. You want to be able to get through the entire cycle of the process. Also, you might want to just hedge your wines against inflation. You know, we tend to find that wine producers have very powerful influences in terms of increasing price. We tend to like producers who are able to put their prices up over a period of time. We call them price makers in that sense. They're able to put increases out and consumers are happy to absorb them because those wines are available in finite quantities. And the demand for those wines always exceeds their supply. So what are the benefits and what is fine wine? There's no real formal definition, but what we like to say is that certainly fine wine, it has to have the capacity to improve with age. That is probably the most important consideration. And that really means we're talking about the top 2% of wine that's available in the retail market. It doesn't exclude very inexpensive wine necessarily, but we tend to find that they are wines that are worth more than £20 a bottle and often £30 or £40 or more. And we can be up to several hundred or even thousands of pounds per bottle. The wines have to be made by someone who's got a very strong brand. It could be someone famous like Dom Perignon or Krug. It could be someone like Penfolds from Australia. It could be a famous Burgundian domain like Domaine de la Romanée-Conti. It could be someone like Sassicaia from Tuscany. We look at those, but we also look at other people who've got strong brands within their own country, region, style, or particular variety in which they're expert. They have to have a really good reputation for high quality over a long period of time. This is really important. It's the one thing that gives people confidence about buying young wines and knowing that they're going to be better in 5 or 10 years of age. We do sometimes buy producers where they don't have that track record, and they can be a more exciting wine to buy, but they don't tend to be a significant part of what we do for the Cellar Plan. We tend to buy wines that are a little better known and come from very strong brands. It obviously also helps if the wines can be difficult to find or buy. So limited supply is a really key consideration. It's not always true. The idea that there is limited supply is probably a more powerful influence. You can go from anything like a small producer in Burgundy who might only make 1 barrel, which would be 300 bottles of wine. And we know those wines are genuinely scarce. But on the other hand, when we're talking about someone like Dom Perignon, that is a wine with a global reputation, a very high price, a very good track record of aging, known high quality, but made in pretty large quantities, maybe 4 or 5 million bottles per year. But the key there is that people feel like the idea that those wines are scarce is very important. And as a powerful brand owner, Moet Hennessy is able to control the price of those wines, genuinely increasing them from one year to the next, and sometimes in periods of really strong demand, even putting them out with price increases multiple times per year. So those things are really important drivers of increases in value in wine over time. The other thing, of course, is consumption. So people need to feel like these wines can age and they will be better in a period of time. What we do tend to find is that the finest wines in the world, bought by the best collectors, don't tend to be drunk when they're young. Even if we had a very good price on, say, a top Grand Cru Burgundy that was only 5 years of age, and we offered it to yourselves or to a restaurant client, we would find a lot of resistance from them to listing those wines, because they know their own clientele would understand that wine's not ready to be drunk. The best situation to be in is when we get to a place where that wine is 10 or 15 years of age, and even if it's quite expensive, we offer it to clients, whether they're a consumer or to the trade, or to yourselves, of course, and they know that there is a client to drink that wine. And at that point in time, the price can be a less important consideration. The fact you've got something that is mature is the key point for that client. And then finally, they just have to be desired by consumers and connoisseurs. We do live in a very complicated fine wine world now. If you went back even 20, 25 years, you would see the whole fine wine market was really dominated by a couple of regions in France in particular. Even Tuscany and Piedmont were relatively poorly developed at that time. Places like Napa in California was very strong domestically in the US, but less well known outside and internationally. But now there is a lot of fine wine being made all over the world in all kinds of places and in all kinds of ways. So we have a very different matrix for selecting them. Primarily, we want to work with people who are making things that are the best of the best. That can mean a top producer in Burgundy, of course, or it could be someone unusual like in Greece who's making the greatest, most age-worthy dry white wines from a volcanic island. If we know that those quantities are small, that no one is making wines anywhere close to them in terms of reputational quality or style, and that there is a market for them, we can be very interested in buying those kinds of wines. That can be more important than following things like critic reviews, for example. So in our selection process, I know it's very common for consumers to see wines that are scored by popular critics, giving them a point score out of 20 or more commonly out of 100. But in those situations, we tend to find that information is not very useful to us, because it's one of the last indicators about quality. We will have already typically tasted the wine. We'll have already had a relationship with the winery or producer. We'll have an understanding of the track record. We're more interested in those kinds of things as a pointer to future quality and future prices than we are about someone who happens to get a high score for a wine that they released last year or something like that. So scores are not that important to us. The final thing about fine wine that's really important to note too is the provenance. Okay, and this is something that you don't need to really think about when you're buying your, I don't know, every day or every week drinking wines from, say, the supermarket or from Majestic or your favorite retailer. By and large, those wines have been moved quite quickly and they're ready to consume. But for fine wine that needs to be aged for a long time, the track record, the history of storage, the frequency of movement of those wines is a very important thing for us to consider. So as much as possible, and the way we've certainly set up the business here so far, is that we only buy as directly as we can. So in many cases, it's from the chateau or the estate or the producer themselves, or we go through their official importer or partner here in the UK, or occasionally one of the Bordeaux negociants who also have access to these wines and are responsible for distributing them globally. We are not buying wines from the secondary market, for example, for the Cellar Plan. While you can find some of the rarest wines in that situation, they tend to be a bit more expensive than what we're looking for the Cellar Plan. And there's a lot more hazard and risk that you have to assess that we're not willing to go through for the Cellar Plan. So we just prefer to buy as directly as possible. So how does it work? I know that some of you on this call have already participated in the Cellar Plan, so it's nice that you're tuning in and seeing, you know, what's happening at the moment. But you've seen how the Cellar Plan works to this point. We really want to know your goals. That's something that is not conveyed that clearly through the sign-up process. But it's always very helpful once you've signed up if we can have some kind of dialogue and I can understand a bit better about what your goals are. So whether that is to make money ultimately or to just put money away, or whether you do think about drinking it, because it may influence our decisions about what we decide to put into your plan. And the other thing that we want to know is how long you want to be involved, because again, that will have some influence in the types of wines that we're putting into your cellar. So once you've decided to sign up, you choose how much you want to put in each month. It's very simple. You can add a one-off boost payment as well if you want to build up a collection a little bit more quickly. And there are some advantages in doing that. You get access to some higher value wines that you might not necessarily be able to access if you were putting a small amount every month. And then we go from there. If you have some preferences, you simply let us know. Every month you're relying on us to put the case into your cellar, and we acknowledge that you're putting a lot of trust into what we do. We think we're worthy of that trust. Mattia and I have spent a lot of time obsessing over what goes into our selection. Mattia in particular, who couldn't join us tonight, but he is deeply obsessive about what goes into our range. And we want to make sure we've only got really good wines. We have some very special partnerships with people, particularly in Italy and in France. We've got some very good professional networks in other parts of the world. As much as possible, we make use of those. You know, we always want to work in areas where we have really specific or very powerful topical knowledge about the region or the producer. We tend to work in regions where we already love the wines. Again, that makes it easier for us to talk to people later on about why these wines are special. It's like wine is unusual in that sense, is it really helps if you believe in what you're buying and selling. Sometimes in other product categories, that's not necessarily an essential feature, but as lovers of wine, we consume a lot of what we buy as well. So I've signed up to a Cellar Plan. We're all buying wines that are available to you as well. So it's important that we buy wines that we're all happy with. So what we do is you allocate a case every month. It's pretty straightforward. We can never allocate exactly the value that you put in. So there'll always be a rolling credit or debit onto your account. We keep a track of that. That'll be updated through our accounting system. That's very easy to follow. Some months we may over allocate in value and you'll be in a little bit more debit. And the following month we may not allocate any wines to your account. But our idea is that at the end of 12 months, you'll have 10 to 12 cases if you choose the smallest plan, 12 cases of 6. If you choose a £500 or a £1,000 plan, you might end up with 18 or 20 or even 30 cases in your plan. But in general, the higher value plans will tend to get higher value wines. So there are some wines that are only available for people who are on the £1,000 a month subscription, for example. At the moment, we can give you a bi-monthly update, which is a download of your cellar. It shows you a recent valuation. The valuation is an estimate. So it's obviously very early days, and oftentimes the valuations haven't changed on those wines. So don't be too bothered if you see small changes there. It's more important to see where they're heading in 1 or 2 years' time. But certainly we've got a project in place at the moment whereby for any of you who have collected whiskey casks through the app, in the next month or two, we hope, you'll also be able to access your Cellar Plan wines through that same app. And at that point, we will start to give you a bit more autonomy on what is going into your selection. So at the moment, it's been easier and quite frankly, simpler for us to choose exactly what's going in. But over time, you'll start to see more options and you can have a little bit more autonomy over what goes into your selection. So it becomes a much more tactile experience, it becomes a lot more rewarding. And we'll also be able to start to distinguish wines that are really only for long-term cellaring, maybe wines that are good for the medium term, and other wines that we really think are there for drinking. And there might be something seasonal that you want to drink over the next 3 to 6 months. Over time, when we move into our new offices, again, a big project that's happening in the next couple of months, we're going to have some fantastic tasting facilities there and a beautiful environment where we will be able to store some of our wines, have them available for tasting on a regular basis. It's right near Green Park Tube, and we will be doing tastings of wines that are in the Cellar Plan. So in this way, you'll have a chance to try wines that are already in your collection, but which you don't have to break a case to try them. And this is really positive. There are other companies who do a Cellar Plan type model. Most of them insist that if you decide you want to try something, you have to take the entire case out and you choose to drink it yourself. So in that way, you learn more about what's in your collection. You may taste something and say, Jesus, Justin, you really don't know what you're talking about. This wine is disgusting. I will never drink this. I would love you to sell it for me as soon as possible. We can do that. Or you might find something that you absolutely adore and you say, I'm going to buy more cases of that, but I'd like to keep one that I will drink myself. And that can also be a very sensible way to build a good collection. We have one client, for example, who's really interested. He's Italian, who's very interested in wines from Piedmont. And we're giving him a more specific choice on a few producers from Barolo and Barbaresco, and going to build up his collection, not only vertically in terms of number of cases, but give him access to some rare, large formats of that same wine. And in that way, you start to build some very compelling offers, which can be great to sell later on, or again, give you more flexibility if you go down the consumption path. And that's really how it works. It's as simple as that. We store all the wine in London City Bond. London City Bond are the largest third-party supplier of secure warehousing for wine and alcohol in the UK. They've been around for about 150 years. Under bond means that you are obviously tax exempt, so you're not paying any duty or VAT at that point. Gives you a little bit of leverage on what you're buying. You only have to pay about just under 80% or around 80% of the total value of that wine. If you ever take it out of bond, of course, you have to pay the duty and the VAT at that time. That's normal. But if you choose to sell it later on under any circumstances, we'll be doing it all under bond, so you won't incur those costs at that point in time. All the wines are also insured at full replacement value. So if something ever does go wrong, that's important to know. And then we do charge storage at the end of the year. We haven't charged anybody storage fees at this point because we're still launching the program and making sure it's running smoothly. But our plan is that at the end of the calendar year, you'll receive an invoice for all the wines in storage, and you'll be charged the equivalent of £7.50 per case of 6. So on a typical Cellar Plan, let's say you had £250 subscription, the end of 12 months, you put in £3,000. You might have 10 cases of wine. You'll pay 10 times £7.50, which is £75 in storage fees. So it works out to be about 1 to 1.5% roughly overall as an annual cost of holding. And that's something that no matter who you store wine with is unavoidable. And those rates are pretty much industry standard. Why can the Cellar Plan suit you? I think I've had a chance to have a conversation with quite a few people interested in starting a Cellar Plan. Most of you are doing it for financial reasons. Many of you have said that you don't know much about wine, or you know a little bit, but certainly the complex fine wine market is not your expertise. I can understand. I've been doing this for 25 years and I'm still learning stuff every day, finding wines that I've never tasted before or heard of, and learning things about different winemaking practices and vineyards and so forth. So it's a very complex area. And I understand that many of you don't have the time or the patience or the wherewithal to be able to do it. So this process can make it really easy for you to build a wine collection without having to get involved in all that rigorous study. But of course, if you choose to do the tasting work, that can be a very rewarding part of the education process as well. There are other reasons. You may not just be aware of what's happening from a trend point of view. It might be that someone you know has been collecting 100-point wines from the early 2000s and think they've got the greatest wine cellar in the world. You could leave them to it. Many of those wines perhaps aren't so good. What's happening today is people are drinking wines that are much more gentle. They're much fresher. They're much more medium-bodied. They're often trying to be a bit lower in alcohol. And so they have a lot more drinkability. So we keep on top of those sorts of trends because we also talk to sommeliers, we talk to other buyers. We want to know what they want to list in their restaurants because this is what's driving the trend in consumption globally. People often want to drink a little bit less, but better as well. This is another major trend. So if all those things suit you and you're happy to rely on our expertise, then the Cellar Plan can be a perfect thing for you to do. It's a simple, safe way to build a really top wine collection. We've been adamant that you are going to be getting fantastic wines from very good producers, from some of the best vintages they've made at good prices. We have been really assiduous in our selection, ensuring that we've got things that are special for the Cellar Plan. A wine that some of you will have received in your first case is one called Giovanni Rosso Barolo. It's from the Cerreta vineyard in Serralunga in Piedmont. That's a wine that we've tasted a couple of times in the last 6 months under different circumstances. We've been to the cellar. The wines are brilliant. They're one of the best wines that we tasted in Piedmont over those 4 days. We had an opportunity to buy a parcel ex-cellars. So we've got good quantities. We've got fantastic pricing. We know 2019 is a vintage that will age spectacularly. It's one of the best in the last 5 years in Piedmont. So for us, it ticks all kinds of boxes. But we've been really, really adamant that we make sure you get the best price for those wines in market. And that's going to be our approach for the Cellar Plan going forward. So We acknowledge that you're placing a lot of trust in us for our expertise, and some of the process is blind and you don't know what you're getting. We really appreciate that, and we're making sure that you're being looked after as a result. It's really important to us. And that's really it. If you want to sell later on, we'll have some more options. We'll have a trading platform. Hopefully this year, you'll be able to sell to other collectors, or external people will be able to buy it. And as I said, there'll be opportunities for you to taste wines that are not only in the Cellar Plan collection already, but wines that we have coming down the pipe that we plan to put into future Cellar Plan allocations. And that just brings me to the last point then, which is what we're buying and what we're not. Because it's important to have a rationale behind our philosophy. And there are obviously many merchants in the UK who are selling wine. It's a very open market. It's important that the wines are drinkable. And I know that sounds like a stupid thing to say, but there are sometimes very famous, very expensive, very positively reviewed wines by critics, which are great to taste, but aren't necessarily that great to drink. They can be very high in alcohol. They can be very high in extract. They can be very chewy. They say they're great for aging. They might be. But the best measure is when you taste a group of these wines on a dinner table and you look at the bottles that are emptied first. That's usually the sign, a really good sign of what people like to drink. And they're often more medium-bodied wines. The most powerful extracted wines tend to sometimes be unfinished on the dinner table. We want to buy wines that are in demand. So Mattia, who's our head buyer, is known as the Wine Hunter. If you don't follow him on Instagram, you should. He has got an instinct for finding wine and networking with people in the production side of the industry that I've met in very, very few people. He has a nose and an obsession with finding things that are great, things that are undiscovered, things that are high quality, things that sommeliers want to drink, things that people want to drink, things that top-end consumers really like to drink. So wines that are in demand are important. Our time frame is important. We're really looking at wines that are going to be at their best, or certainly in a good drinking place, over the next 3 to 10 years. There are some wines that mature much longer than that, which we're not looking at. And a good example would be the top young wines from Bordeaux. So we are not doing any Bordeaux en primeur. The wines in the last 10 years, if you're a financially oriented investor, have not performed well. They typically lose value for many years after they're released. And even people who bought great vintages like 2009 and 2010 are still underwater on what they paid for those wines. In 5 or 10 or 20 years, they'll be great, and they probably will be worth quite a lot of money. But in the short term and for the horizon we're looking at, they're not wines of interest. We are going to be selective about what we do with Bordeaux. We may buy some parcels of older stocks, wines that are already 5 or 8 or 10 years or more, when we can get them from the negociants, ex-sellers at a decent price. But we're not making any headway or plans or interest in buying very young Bordeaux. And a lot of other parts of the market are, to their detriment, unfortunately, completely tied up with buying those wines. And they spend 2 or 3 months a year trying to sell them to their clientele. So we are just moving around it. As I said, if the producer is the best of their kind, whether that means they're a volcanic island in the Cyclades in Greece, or a producer making top-end Burgundy in the Mosel Valley, top-end Pinot Noir rather, in the Mosel Valley in Germany, a mountain Cabernet in Napa, or a top Chardonnay from Margaret River, we're interested. You know, if they're wines that people want to drink and they're top quality and no one is competing with them and the price is good, we're definitely interested. But we do have regions where we have expertise and preference. So Italy is clearly a position of strength. Mattia's background is Italy, knows the wines from Italy obviously super well. We've got other people working with us who are also Italian who are helping us improve our range there. It's an easy place to get to. We've got great connections there, and we tend to love the wines, particularly from places like Mount Etna, particularly from Piedmont, Barolo and Barbaresco, some producers in Tuscany and Campania. We've got some great relationships in Burgundy. And even though it's a very difficult region to break into because the wines are really the most highly regarded in the world and the prices have been pretty stratospheric in the last few years, we've got good relationships there, but they are slow to build. And then in Champagne is a place we've got some fantastic new agencies which are arriving in the next few months, so that we hope you'll start to see more things in those kinds of places. We're looking at wines in Spain, Germany, and then selectively from other parts of the New World where there are strong brands in Australia or the US or South Africa, even Austria and Greece. So yeah, where we're not buying top-end Bordeaux, we won't buy things like young vintage port for the same reasons. They take too long to mature. We won't be buying things for the cellar plan like fortified wines, sherries. Again, they're great to drink, but they're not necessarily wines that go up in value, and sherries are released ready to consume. They don't improve in bottle, so they won't be going in. We're not looking for 100-point Parker wines. We're not looking for super high scoring wines. If they get a good score because they're well balanced, fantastic, but that's not the reason why we will go looking for them. We don't want heavy internationalized styles. So where the winemaking influence, perhaps of, say, a famous winemaking consultant who uses techniques like, I don't know, very late picking, short fermentation, lots of maceration, lots of new oak, to try and get a very impactful wine, but where the winemaking techniques completely overcome the identity of the wine's origin, we're not really interested in wines like that much either. That means we often rule out wines from South America. It's not that they can't be good to drink. It just means that for those kinds of wines, there's not necessarily a strong demand in the secondary market. People buy them because they love them to drink, but then later on, they don't tend to go up in value, or if you have them to sell, there's not a lot of demand for drinking 5-year-old or 10-year-old Argentine Malbec, for example. We also stay away from extremely natural wines. We do like to work with producers who are highly sustainable. They might be employing organic techniques, biodynamic techniques, but we want wines that are clean, well-made, sound, fault-free, and not fragile, because those wines, they could look like crap in 6 months or 2 years and not be great to drink. And again, they don't tend to be wanted by people when they're that old. And then finally, we obviously won't be buying mass market wines. So things that you see in the supermarket, things that you find in maybe multiple retailers, by and large, those kinds of wines, even if they're not that they're expensive, but let's say they're 10, 15, 20, 25 pounds even, many of those wines are really made with the immediate consumption in mind. They're not made for longer term aging. And that's really it. That's the very short summary. I think we've done about 40 minutes. I know it's a lot of talking and probably a bit of waffle at the start until we've, finally got on the wavelength and got into our groove. But that's the very short summary.